Welcome, everyone. Delighted to see you all here. My name's Peter Manuelian. I'm director of the H-Main, and in the absence of our HMSC director, Caroline Fernald, I get to introduce our speaker and welcome all of you to this, our final Egyptology lecture of the semester. Tonight's lecture is co-sponsored by the Harvard Museum of the Ancient Near East and also Harvard Museums of Science and Culture. To learn more about upcoming museum events, I invite you to visit our website, hmsc.harvard.edu. We've got several educational and fun opportunities and programs for adults, teens, and children. And we're grateful, as always, to all our members and supporters for making these programs possible. And now, I have the privilege of introducing tonight's very distinguished speaker, Dr. Denise Doxey. She's curator of ancient Egyptian, Nubian, and Near Eastern art at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. So long trip all the way across the Charles River. Previously, she was keeper of collections for the Egyptian section of the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, now the Penn Museum. It's a lot easier to say these days. She received her MPhil in classical archaeology from Oxford University, and her PhD in ancient history from the University of Pennsylvania. Her teaching experience includes Egyptology courses at the University of Pennsylvania and right here at Harvard as well. She's participated in excavations in Egypt at the site of Abydos and Saqqara. And in addition to numerous articles, she's the author or co-author of 5 books, most recently, Arts of Ancient Nubia. She served on the board of the International Council of Museums International Committee for Egyptology, and is currently the president of the Board of Governors of the American Research Center in Egypt, whose annual meeting just concluded in Denver last weekend, so she has rushed back to Boston to be with us. In her time at the MFA, she's overseen the renovation of galleries for pre-dynastic and early dynastic art, Old Kingdom art, and Middle Kingdom funerary art. She was curator for the 2019 special exhibit, Ancient Nubia Now, which was a magnificent display, by the way, of the MFA's vast Nubian holdings, and is still available online in a virtual tour, so by all means, go and find it. She's currently planning for the reinstallation of the MFA's Nubian collection, so tonight's topic is particularly timely, and I hope you will join me in welcoming Dr. Denise Doxey.
Well, thank you, Peter, for that kind introduction. And also thank you very much for inviting me to be here tonight. I have titled this talk somewhat euphemistically, The Enigmatic Treasure of an Ancient Nubian Queen. This is because it wouldn't sound nearly as good to say the completely confusing and confounding treasure of an ancient Nubian queen, or the just plain weird treasure of an ancient Nubian queen. The queen in question is named Queen Khensa, and she was married to one of the most powerful and most famous Nubian kings recorded in history. But since Khensa is probably not a household name for many people, I hope that you will bear with me for a few minutes while I give you a kind of chronological and geographic context for Queen Khensa's existence. Now, the Museum of Fine Arts Boston owes its Nubian collection, which is about 25,000 objects, to excavations led by George Andrew Reisner, also well known here at Harvard. And in addition to Reisner himself, the man that's standing to his left, our right, is Dowes Dunham, the very tall one. And he is the one who was responsible for publishing most of this material. He actually sort of gave up his museum career to make sure that this material became available in a monumental series of big volumes called Ancient Cemeteries of Kush. Now, in 1919, the expedition visited the site of el-Kurru, where they excavated the tombs of a number of early kings of what we call the Napatan period, and I'll get to them in a minute, including King Piankhy, whose reign was about 743 to 712 BCE. And it's an indication of just how fuzzy this history is that Piankhy was a great king. He conquered Egypt. People can't even agree what his name was. He sometimes puts the Ankh sign in the middle, sometimes he doesn't, and there are people with strong opinions, whether he's PA or Piankhy. Frankly, I don't have a horse in that race. I'm just going to go with Piankhy because I like it better, and that's what we've decided to use in our MFA documentation. So I'm not going to argue the benefits of calling him Piankhy versus PA, but I'm just going to be consistent. When we talk about ancient Nubia, we usually we generalize and refer to the area from about Aswan in the north to a little below Khartoum in the south. So the southernmost part of Egypt and the northernmost part of Sudan. But that is actually an overgeneralization. That was never actually the border. Whenever Egypt's power was ascendant, they would take over parts of Nubia. When Nubia's power was ascendant, they would take over parts of Egypt. So the border was constantly going back and forth. Now, in about 1550 BCE, the Egyptians, at the height of their power in the New Kingdom, actually conquered not most of Nubia, but all the way down to this area, and controlled it for 500 years. So there was a lot of interaction, a lot of entanglement and intermarriage and sharing of religious ideas going in both directions. And this is where Queen Khensa comes into the world. The area we're talking about, el-Kurru, you can see on the map right there, was the earlier cemetery of this period. Nuri was the later cemetery. And in the center was the site of Jebel Barkal, which was in antiquity called Napata. And that has given its name to the Napatan period, which we will be talking about today. It's a massive stone outcropping, sort of flat top mesa that sticks out hundreds of feet around the surrounding desert, and you can see it from miles away. And this was undoubtedly a sacred place for the Nubians from time immemorial. But when the Egyptians were in Nubia, they built the first temples there, which were later expanded enormously by the indigenous Nubian kings. So by the time our friend Piankhy comes to power, the border was already well up into Egypt. Nubia was already controlling all the way up to about Abydos in the center of Egypt. So the purple on the map. And this book I show here, this is the source from which I stole the map, so credit where credit is due. Now the northernmost part of Egypt was divided among a series of people who called themselves kings of Egypt, but they were not kings of all of Egypt by any means. They were kings of their own little segment. And what happened is that the yellow section, which was under the control of this king Piankhy best, came under attack, or incursion at least, from the green zone, which was led by Tefnacht, and to the south, the beige, which was run by Nimlat. Now, Piankhy best was an ally of Piankhy. And so he sought help from Piankhy, and after Piankhy sent his troops, eventually Piankhy himself led troops there. There were a series of back and forth battles, but eventually Piankhy succeeded in conquering all of the north of Egypt. So for the first time and only time ever, there's been one entity controlling the Nile Valley from below Khartoum all the way to the Mediterranean. We know all of this because he recorded it in a number of different places, including on this large stele, his so-called victory stele, in which he goes into great detail about these various battles. And he sets himself up as the rightful heir to the god Amun, the main god of the Theban pantheon, who had been adopted by the Nubians by this point. And he eventually, here we have all of these Egyptian minor kings he defeated, and finally Nimlat, the last one to go. And in this stele, he describes the conquest of Nimlat's, the last holdout. And in it, he mentions some interesting events. For one thing, he was offered the royal women, and he turned them down. He wanted the royal horses, so he took them. And he took vast quantities of precious metal, gold, silver, semi-precious stones, vessels, jewelry, and then he went back down to Egypt with it. And there in 1990, National Geographic rendered his victory this way. And there you can see his prancing horse in the background and an object from the MFA in the foreground. So anyway, he went back to Napata, but his four successors, and again, people can't agree on the spelling of their names, Shebetka, Shabaka, Taharka, and Tanwetamane, actually ruled much of the year from Memphis, the ancient capital of Egypt. So at this point, they were even more closely interacting with Egypt. So here's where they're buried, at the site of el-Kurru in pyramids. They were originally pyramids. None of the pyramids, except for this big one, which is much later, actually still have any of their stone. It was all quarried away. But we see where they were buried along the ridge at the highest part of the cemetery of el-Kurru. Now we know from historical sources that Piankhy had at least 5 queens, including Albar, Neferukashta, Pesketer, Tabiri, and Khensa. Now, of these queens, some of them were buried at el-Kurru, some were not. So here off in the desert, there's sort of a wadi that runs through the thing, and then the other high ground, but not near Piankhy, is a group of 4 tombs of members of his royal family. Some of them, at least some of them, queens. And just about a month ago, when I was down at the University of Virginia and gave a talk about these queens. So today I'm going to leave these queens aside and talk about Khensa instead. But you can see where the green circle is Piankhy's pyramid. They're quite far away. They're not exactly right up close. And they're fairly humble tombs. Some of them, like the one on the top that you see, are simply a shaft with a built-up platform in the center where the burial bed would be placed. Or, as the more elaborate one of Queen Tabiri on the bottom, you see that there is a shaft leading down to a separate burial chamber, and in the burial chamber, there is a platform for the burial. All of these tombs, kings, queens, and otherwise, were looted in antiquity. So it gets to be kind of dodgy, sketchy ground to start saying, well, if this tomb had this and this tomb didn't, is this more important than another? Because the robbers took most of it, and you can't really argue from absence that someone is more or less important. But just to give you an idea of some of the things that were in these relatively humble-looking tombs, we have some spectacular jewelry. These are all from the same tomb. The robbers were kind of careless in this tomb, apparently. And so they missed a large group of really beautifully designed jewelry, some of which has been argued to have been among that loot that Piankhy brought back from Egypt. They also have these faience pectoral amulets, which are big. I mean, some of them are like this. And they come in a variety of styles and sizes. And some of them, like these, represent sort of Egyptian-style deities. Others represent very un-Egyptian-style deities, like these 2 goddesses who seem to come in pairs. There's dozens of pairs of these. And while what's interesting to me, I think, is that Khensa, when we get to her in one slide, has none of these. And again, when I say you can't say that the absence of something proves it was never there because the robbers might have gotten it. The fact that the robbers left dozens and dozens and dozens of these in the other tombs of Piankhy's royal family makes me wonder if she ever did have any of them. These are very short-lived fads, sort of. They look like they all could have been made in 1 or 2 workshops, and they really don't outlast the reign of Piankhy by very much. So let's instead move over to Khensa. Khensa was buried in a pyramid, not too far from Piankhy, on the same high ridge with the other kings and most important queens. So this suggests that Khensa is a more important queen, but it could also suggest that she was just a queen at a different time. Dow's Dunham, who published these, believed that she outlived Piankhy and was ultimately buried by Taharqa, who was his 3rd of his 4 successors, who were the 25th Dynasty of Egypt. Which is something I actually failed to mention before. It was after he took over Egypt and his 4 successors ruled in Egypt, they became Egypt's 25th dynasty. And they were not seen by the Egyptians in any way as unjust conquerors. They were embraced as a dynasty unto themselves. They did a lot of building in Egypt, a lot of restoring of temples in Egypt. And so they were seen as very legitimate Egyptian rulers, even though they were from Nubia. So anyway, if indeed Khensa outlived Piankhy and was buried later on, it could explain why her burial goods differ so much from the other queens that were buried in the tombs 51 to 55. You can see in the plan and elevation of her tomb her pyramid was significantly more elaborate than anything that the other queens had. It was reached by a staircase with a sort of antechamber and then a burial chamber with the bed for her burial. Now, in the case of these, when we can say, how do we know whose tomb was whose? None of them were decorated, and so it really relies on having inscribed objects left behind. So in the case of Khensa's tomb, we have a number of inscribed objects, including things like this offering table, which was found in the staircase. It looks to me sort of unfinished. It's pretty roughly formed, but it has a nice Egyptian hieroglyphic inscription around the edges. And these kings, while ruling from Egypt, were using Egyptian language and script for all of their inscriptions, which is great for us because we can read that. We know a lot more about these kings than we do, say, of some of the later kings. Now, a number of people have worked on the material from this tomb, including Dulles Dunham back in the day. Tim Kendall did a lot of work on this in the 1980s and even more recently than that. And I think Tim's on Zoom. Hi, Tim. And most recently, Jesper Gaunt in the Festschrift for Peter Rockavara, which just came out, is hot off the presses, did an analysis of some of this material. But nevertheless, it remains somewhat murky, to say the least. So if you are hoping to leave here with a crystal clear new interpretation of what all of this means, you are going to be woefully disappointed. Now, right at the entrance of the antechamber, a number of objects were left by tomb robbers who obviously climbed right over it. And many of these are somewhat enigmatic, and I do thank Tim Kendall for a lot of the research that went into these. Inside this circle, there is a bronze offering tray, which here it is after excavation, but before conservation. And I don't have a good color picture of it because it's enormous. It's about 1 meter in diameter, just under 1 meter in diameter. And it's currently stored in a special box up on a high shelf where taking it down requires special assistance. So I did not take it down. But you can see it's got a raised center, so it must have had, it's sort of a sort of platform for something. And it has these beautiful little handles in the form of lions with sort of double-headed lions. It has since been conserved and cleaned and looks somewhat better than it does here. Now, if you look inside the offering tray, you'll see a cylindrical vessel. And that is the vessel that you see here on the right, which is inscribed with Khensa's name. It's silver, which is a fairly rare material for ancient Nubia, but quite a plain cylindrical shape. And inside of it was the vessel that you see on the left, which is a double-spouted cup, also made of silver, considerably smaller. The cup is an interesting design because it was clearly intended to pour libations. The fact that the top is half covered is a clever design so that when you're tilting it to pour the libations, they will go out the spouts, but they won't spill over the neck, which suggests that they were used for something that was fairly slow and deliberate. It wasn't just... Tim Kendall hypothesized that this was a libation of milk because we do have texts that mention offerings of milk in various temple and funerary contexts. And he also suggested that perhaps the shape and the double spout were meant to refer to breasts, which I'm not sure. I think they could have looked more like breasts if they wanted them to, but it's an interesting idea. It is difficult to explain why it's a double spout, not a single spout. Along with these objects were found these very tall, they're like 10 inches tall. What Dunham suggested might be coal sticks. Now, they're awfully huge to be coal sticks. They're also made of silver. Tim Kendall noted that they're just the right size to be used in conjunction with those two spouts in some capacity. Now, it wouldn't be completely out of keeping for the Napatan rulers to have vastly oversized cosmetic equipment either, because a couple of generations later, King Espelta had 8-inch long tweezers in his tomb and various precious metals. One of these has the head of a falcon and the other the head of a jackal. So we can wonder, are they Anubis and Horus? Probably not. Could they be two of the four sons of Horus, Kebek, Senwef, and Duamutef? Maybe. Or they could be, as Tim Kendall suggested, the spirits of Pa and Neken, which are these one jackal-headed set and one falcon-headed set of deities who you see later on in Nubian coffin benches, for example. So they seem to have had a big role in Nubian funerary beliefs. So it isn't entirely clear who they are. And then also in this same group of objects inside the white circle, we have these, which are bronze. They're straight cylinders. They're open at the bottom. And the tops are shaped in the form of human hands wearing bracelets of what was originally elaborate cloisonné enamel, multicolored enamel set into these little decorative areas. They don't match exactly. And they in turn are holding another hollow cylinder. I guess being a cylinder, you have to be hollow by definition, but and which must have held something. So that it looks as if they had some kind of maybe a perishable material like wood post leading up into the bottom of them, and then another coming out the top. So Dunham, back in his original publication of this, suggested that they are canopy poles, because you do see representations of kings and queens standing with people holding canopies over them. And that's as good as a good explanation as I can think of, so I will go along with that. So moving into the burial chamber, this is what it looks like as it was found. There's the platform in the middle on which her coffin was originally placed. And these little boxes that you see in front of it are actually travertine or Egyptian alabaster bed leg supports. So her funerary bed would have been placed, the feet of her funerary bed on top of the platform would have been placed into these four bases. Nothing survives of her coffin because the conditions for burials in northern Sudan now are just really not conducive. A lot of these tombs had a lot of moisture, the groundwater. They also had insects, so that anything wood basically did not survive. But we have little tantalizing glimpses of what kind of coffin she might have had, because we have bags and bags of gold leaf. So the coffin must originally have been wood, but gilded. And between tomb robbers and other damage, most of the gilding is gone, but we still do have some images of some hints of what this coffin must have looked like. We have a really beautiful travertine offering table, which, like the bigger granite one I showed you earlier, lists her as being a queen's daughter, a queen's mother, and a king's wife. And it shows various offerings for the afterlife in a very Egyptian style. We have some of her canopic equipment, in this case, the head of one of the four sons of Horus, Imseti, and jars inscribed with her names, another way that we know who she is. And then we have a number of other alabaster vessels, or travertine vessels, including these two, which would originally have been the same shape. The one on the left-hand side has lost its neck, and the one on the right-hand side still has its neck but has lost its spout. And you can see where the spout would have joined the jar right there. I mean, not the spout, I'm sorry, the handle. No spout. And these, here, you can see this one in more detail. These have gotten a lot of attention because, I mean, back in the aughts, when the Metropolitan Museum did their massive and masterful exhibition, Assyria to Iberia, several of these trefoil-mouthed anaquis, as they're called, were included in the publication. And my colleague Larry Berman wrote about this particular one, which is inscribed with the name and titles of Khensa. Now, these jars are well attested throughout the Phoenician world. So they're literally found, they're most commonly this type of vessel in metal, but also in pottery. And as the Metropolitan Museum's title suggests, they are found everywhere from Assyria to Iberia. There are two examples from Spain and one from Israel, the pottery one. The pottery one is the most close in shape to Queen Khensa's, and they have that very distinctive little floral motif at the base of the handle. Now, Jasper Gaunt, in his most recent publication, looked also at ewers like this, which were made of ostrich shell. And he suggested, this is also from Spain, he suggested that Queen Khensa's jar might be a diplomatic gift from the Phoenicians or from someone in the Phoenician sphere who were inspired, because ostrich shells were native to Nubia, to deliberately give her a vessel in the shape of an ostrich egg. I think that's a little bit of a stretch, honestly, because travertine is ubiquitous in Egypt. They wouldn't have had to get it from farther away than that. And as I say, these jars are found all over the Mediterranean world, so there's no reason to think that couldn't have gotten to Queen Khensa in some more straightforward way. Now we start getting other little strange objects from Khensa's tomb that are harder to explain even than the jar. And these two objects, they're sort of floral motifs in steatite, glazed steatite, little drop-shaped objects, and there were several of these in the tomb. They're not pierced or anything, so no one knows exactly what they might have been intended to become beads of some kind, but were never finished. But then my favorite thing in the tomb is her rock collection. I mean, I have to say, I like to vision her sort of like a budding naturalist out there creating her chamber of curiosities by collecting interesting little stones. But I think obviously there's going to be more to it than that. And some of them are just naturally occurring sort of these flint nodules that people who live in desert areas can just walk around and find everywhere. And others are beautifully colored, often very uniformly shaped, semi-precious stones and other stones that are just beautiful for their own sake. And here are these stones again. And this is another type of object that Jasper Gaunt thought were diplomatic gifts. And he compared it to the biblical account of the Queen of Sheba giving precious, semi-precious stones as a gift for King Solomon. But again, I mean, these stones are found in Nubia. I don't think they need to be a diplomatic gift from anywhere. When we look at these humble flint nodules, as I say, these are not inherently valuable. They're cool looking, but for some reason, one of the objects from Queen Khensa's tomb is one of these pebbles that's been adorned with gold bands, as though it was going to be turned into a necklace or a pendant or some kind of an object that needed to be suspended. So obviously these were special to Khensa in a way that we can't now fully understand. Now, some of the stones must have been chosen because they look like, they resemble objects that have sort of sculptural shapes. Like this looks like a winged sun disk in a way. I'll let you speculate about some of the others. But some of them, I wonder if they could have been raw materials, because some of these interestingly shaped stones have begun to be carved into something. So, for example, we have this little, it looks like a pomegranate maybe, and then this cute little stone, this is only about this big, if in that, which was kind of not the finest quality of carving of the face, but it was obviously being turned into something, whether it's by a craftsman or craftsperson or Queen Khensa herself, who knows. But here I'm picking on Jasper Gaunt, but he suggested that this might be the beginnings of what was going to be carved into an arabelos, which is an often human-headed small ointment jar. But I think this is way too small. While these things are not very big, they tend to be 2 or 3 inches tall, this one's not even 1 inch tall. So it wouldn't have held very much. So we have the mystery of the stones. Now, it so happens that back in 2008, excavating at the temple B700 at Jebel Barkal itself, right at the main temple at the foot of that cliff I showed earlier, Tim Kendall and his team found a stash of these stones. 620 of them. And they're found in a Napatan temple that was built over an Egyptian temple, right around these sort of basins. And if you look at their shapes, they're very, very, very much like some of those. Not the semi-precious stones and the pretty shiny colored stones, but these flint nodules and these sort of peanut-shaped stones. So in this context, clearly there is a religious connotation to what these stones are doing. Exactly what I'm not even going to hazard a guess, but I think it takes these out of the realm of just humble stone collecting, although I like that idea a lot. But these obviously have some sort of ritual function that is just not understood. It gets even weirder though, because in Queen Khensa's tomb, we have faux stone nodules made of faience. This looks like it's a banded agate or some sort of a striped stone, but it's in fact a reproduction of a stone made in faience. Why, when you have real stones, do you have to make a reproduction of faience is anybody's guess. We also have made of faience these objects that are called bunches of grapes. And they look like bunches of grapes. I could believe they're bunches of grapes. But if you back up a little ways and look at some of these funny nodules, could these be yet another case of reproduction stone nodules that happen to look like grapes? Some of these stones in Queen Khensa's collection are actually fossils back from the day when the Egypt and Sudan were underwater. And so we have this starfish or anemone. I'm not an expert on sea creatures, but so she or her representatives were out there collecting interesting natural specimens of the ancient history of her region. But she also has reproduction shells and reproduction sea creatures. For example, this is actually a land snail, not a sea creature. But it's inscribed a shell-shaped, snail-shaped shell that is made out of glazed steatite. So it's completely artificial, but it's very realistically carved, particularly on the bottom where they even have carved out the indentation up the middle of it. And it is inscribed with a prayer for Khensa. Less odd, but still odd, is this inscribed steatite ball, about the same size. It's about an inch in diameter, which has a protective wadjet eye on both top and bottom, and then inscriptions with the names and titles of Khensa. What this is used for, again, it's not pierced for suspension of anything, so it's hard to say. Tim Kendall speculated that perhaps this and some of those very uniformly shaped semi-precious stone sort of marbles might have been used in some kind of a game or ceremony. The last thing I'm going to show you is this banded agate bowl, which is an absolutely gorgeous object, obviously originally intended to have a top because the inside is unfinished. And this is a case in which Jasper points out that this kind of stone is found primarily in Assyria, and that this could well be a gift or exchange object from Assyria, because it's known that the Assyrians and the Napatan Nubians were in contact with one another. One of the objects that they were trading was horses, which the Nubians trained and sent to Assyria. They were friendly at this point. That would not last. Eventually they would. Now, whether this was actually part of the horse trade, as Jasper suggested, I don't know, but I think there's a good possibility that could be its place of origin. So I went through this a little faster than I thought I would, but so in conclusion, my thoughts at this point is that Napatan Nubia was a very cosmopolitan place. There are trade and interconnections, not necessarily directly, but they're very much involved in this greater Mediterranean world and East and Southwestern Asian world as well. And the kings, particularly when they were living in Egypt, had undoubtedly great opportunities to interact and exchange with the rulers of other regions. And people like the Phoenicians were everywhere. So it's not really surprising that a lot of these objects have parallels elsewhere. I do think that the stones may have been, in the case of the precious, semi-precious stones, destined to be made into jewelry or other objects. The nodules clearly had a meaning that we don't understand, but the Napatans did. And I still like to think of Queen Khensa because this is such a unique tomb assemblage and not something that robbers would have taken from other tombs, it still remains sort of unique, and I can't help but think of Queen Khensa as an early would-be geologist. Thank you.